The bell for first period hadn't even finished its shrill, metallic scream, but the war had already begun. It was a silent, seething war, fought not with weapons, but with glares, with posture, with the simple, brutal act of claiming space. On one side of Mr. Davison's history classroom sat Jade. She was a fortress of quiet intensity, her textbooks arranged in a perfect, parallel line at the top right corner of her desk. Her pen was already out, her notebook open to a fresh, clean page. She was the kind of student who didn't just do the homework, she anticipated the follow-up questions, her mind always 3 steps ahead of the curriculum. Her pride was not a loud thing, it was a deep, unshakable foundation. It was in the unwavering confidence of her answers, the slight, almost imperceptible lift of her chin when she knew she was right. She built her walls not from brick and mortar, but from A+ essays and flawless project presentations. They were high and strong, and she was safe behind them. And on the other side of the room, a force of nature was purposefully trying to dismantle them, brick by brick. Ryder sauntered in, always a calculated few seconds late, his presence seeming to shift the very air in the room. Where Jade was quiet order, Ryder was charming chaos. His backpack was slung over one shoulder, his collar was never quite straight, and he carried with him an easy, infuriating arrogance that seemed to suggest the world was his for the taking. He didn't need the perfect lines or the preemptive notes. He absorbed information like a sponge, and his brilliance was a flash of lightning, sudden, dazzling, and utterly disruptive. His charm was a weapon he wielded with a smirk, disarming teachers and winning over classmates with a lazy grin, all while his sharp eyes missed nothing, especially not Jade. Their rivalry was an institution within the school, a legend passed down from one grade to the next. It was instinctual, a fundamental law of the universe, like gravity or the changing of the seasons. The sun rose, the sun set, and Jade and Ryder were at each other's throats. It sparked over everything, great and small. It was a constant, low-grade hum of animosity that could erupt into a blaze at any moment. The first skirmish of the day was over the class project. Mr. Davison, a man who had long since given up trying to understand the dynamic, sighed wearily as he wrote the assignment on the board. For this term's major grade, you will be paired up to create a detailed presentation on a pivotal historical figure. I will be assigning the partners. A tense silence fell over the room. Every single student knew what was coming. They watched, half in dread, half in fascination, as the teacher's eyes scanned his list, his forehead creased in a frown. He knew. They all knew. Jade, Mr. Davison said, his voice heavy with resignation. You'll be with Ryder. A collective, barely audible gasp rippled through the classroom. Jade's spine went ramrod straight. She didn't look at Ryder, but her knuckles, gripping her pen, turned white. This was a catastrophe. A project with Ryder meant late submissions wrapped in a clever excuse, ideas that were brilliant but half-formed, and a constant, exhausting battle for control. It meant her perfect A was now in the hands of the most unreliable, infuriating person she had ever met. Ryder, for his part, simply leaned back in his chair, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across his face. Looking forward to it, partner, he said, his voice a low, teasing drawl that was meant only for her. Jade's head snapped towards him, her eyes flashing with pure fire. Don't call me that, she hissed, the words sharp and quiet. The second battle came during the pop quiz. Mr. Davison passed out the papers, and the room filled with the frantic scratching of pens. Jade's hand flew across the page, her answers precise and certain. She finished with 5 minutes to spare, placing her pen down with a soft, final click. A moment later, she heard a similar click from the desk beside her. She refused to look. She knew. He had finished at the exact same time. It was always like this. A dead heat. A tie that felt more like a loss. They both stood at the same moment to hand in their papers. They reached the teacher's desk in unison. There was a brief, ridiculous standoff, a silent argument over who would place their quiz on the stack first. It was a tiny, meaningless victory, but to them, it was everything. Jade, with a surge of stubborn pride, slid her paper onto the pile a fraction of a second before he did. A triumphant, smug warmth spread through her chest. Ryder just chuckled, a soft, knowing sound as he dropped his paper on top of hers. After you, he murmured, and the warmth in her chest instantly turned to ice. He had let her win, and that was 1,000 times worse than if he had beaten her. The final, daily confrontation happened after class. The hallway was a river of students, a chaotic current of shouts and slamming lockers. Jade was at her locker, carefully swapping her history book for her science text, when a familiar, unwelcome presence leaned against the locker next to hers. Quite the performance in there, Ryder said, crossing his arms. You nearly broke your neck rushing to hand in that quiz. Afraid I'd get there first. Jade slammed her locker shut, the metallic clang a satisfying punctuation to her anger. I'm afraid of nothing, especially not you. I just prefer to operate on a schedule, something your chronic tardiness wouldn't understand. Maybe I just have better things to do than be the first one in a room, he shot back, his eyes glinting with amusement. He loved this. He loved getting under her skin. So, about this project. My place or yours? I'm free tonight. The only place you need to be is the library, doing the research you should have started weeks ago, Jade retorted, her voice tight. We'll meet tomorrow after school. In the library. Don't be late. Wouldn't dream of it, he said, pushing off the lockers and giving her a mock salute. See you then, partner. He turned and melted into the crowd, leaving her standing there, her heart pounding with a familiar, frustrating fury. She watched him go, his easy stride, the way other students naturally parted for him. He was a storm, and she was the immovable object. They were two unstoppable forces, destined to collide. Every interaction was a fresh layer of brick and mortar on the wall between them, a wall that felt as high and as permanent as the school itself. It was exhausting. It was infuriating. And as much as she hated to admit it, even to herself in the deepest, most hidden part of her mind, it was the only thing that made the school day feel truly, electrically alive. The school trip was supposed to be a respite from the pressurized environment of classrooms and competition. The mountain air was fresh and clean, scented of pine and damp earth. For Jade, it was a chance to observe geological formations with her analytical mind, adding another layer to her academic armor. For Ryder, it was a playground to explore with restless energy, turning the educational hike into a personal adventure. Their mutual animosity, however, was a stubborn passenger on the bus ride, represented by the empty seat neither would occupy. The hike began with the class strung out along a narrow path through dense evergreens. Sunlight dappled the forest floor while cheerful chatter echoed through the trees. Jade walked near the front, mentally cataloging moss and rock types. Ryder drifted in the middle, his laughter occasionally floating forward, making Jade's shoulders tense. The peace was fragile, waiting to be shattered. The conflict began over the route to the summit. The park ranger had indicated two paths, one longer and gradual, the other steep and direct. The class was to take the easier path. The steeper path is more efficient, Ryder declared, his voice cutting through the discussion. Why waste an hour on switchbacks when you can reach the top in 20 minutes? Jade turned from studying the trail map. Efficiency isn't just about speed. The gradual path is safer, less eroded, and allows for proper observation. The steep path is reckless for those who value destination over journey. Their eyes locked, the familiar current of rivalry crackling in the mountain air. Other students fell silent, sensing the shift. Reckless? Ryder challenged, smirking. Or are you afraid of a little challenge? Afraid you might not be the best at climbing a hill? The accusation hit its mark. Her composure tightened. This isn't about fear. It's about following rules and using common sense, something you consistently ignore. Rules are for people who can't think for themselves, he shot back. I'm taking the steep path. Anyone who wants to actually reach the top can join me. It was a public challenge. Jade's pride wouldn't allow him to win. Fine, she said sharply. I'll go with you. Someone should be there to explain your poor choices when you twist an ankle. With shared defiance, they broke from the group. The argument continued as they climbed, their voices rising over labored breathing and crunching gravel. They bickered about the slope's angle, the rock types, each other's life choices. The forest closed around them, classmate sounds fading to nothing. Consumed by their clashing wills, they failed to notice the changing sky. The brilliant blue faded to bruised gray. Sunlight vanished beneath ominous shadows. A cold, sharp wind whispered urgently through pines. The air grew heavy and damp. The first fat, cold raindrop hit Jade's cheek. She stopped arguing mid-sentence, head jerking up. Another hit Ryder's arm. Both fell silent, the petty quarrel forgotten as they stared at the churning sky. Just a passing shower, Ryder said, confidence edged with uncertainty. He was wrong. The shower became a deluge in seconds. The sky tore open, releasing torrents of cold, relentless rain. Wind howled, whipping stinging rain horizontally. The path became a treacherous stream of mud and slippery stones. The world dissolved into roaring wind, pounding rain, and frantic heartbeats. We need shelter. Jade yelled over the storm's fury. Her hair was plastered down, clothes soaked and clinging, heavy with cold. For once, Ryder didn't argue. He nodded grimly, scanning the blurry, rain-swept landscape. Visibility dropped to feet. Retracing their steps was impossible. They were lost, disoriented, exposed. There! Ryder shouted, pointing toward a dark shape against a rocky outcrop. A small structure of weathered wood, nearly invisible against the forest. Old, forgotten. Stumbling, slipping, clutching each other for balance from pure survival instinct, they half ran, half fell toward it. A storage cabin, its windows boarded, door a single slab of thick timber. Ryder grabbed the rusty iron handle and pulled. It didn't budge. He threw his shoulder against it, once, twice, wet with groaning. With a final, desperate heave from both, the door gave way with a splintering crack, swinging inward to reveal a dark, dusty void. They fell inside, gasping, dripping onto rough wooden floors. Sudden silence shocked them after the storm's roar. Wind and rain became muted pounding on the roof. The air was still, cold, thick with smells of old wood, dust, and decay. As eyes adjusted to gloom, shapes emerged, haphazard wooden crates, rusted tools in a corner, one small, high window with grimy glass. Ryder pushed the heavy door shut, plunging them into near-total darkness, only faint gray glow from the high window remaining. The iron latch fell with a dull, final thud. A prison door closing. They were trapped not by a lock, but by nature's fury beyond the thin walls. They stood shivering in dark, the weight of their situation settling like dust in air. The argument over the path had become the most costly mistake of their lives. The first hour was a symphony of shared misery, conducted in a bitter, resentful silence. The initial shock of their entrapment wore off, leaving behind the raw, cold reality. Water dripped from their hair and clothes, forming small, dark puddles on the dusty floorboards. The temperature in the uninsulated cabin was plummeting, the dampness seeping into their bones, making their teeth chatter uncontrollably. The only sound was the relentless drumming of the rain on the roof, a constant, maddening reminder of their isolation. Jade stood rigidly near the door, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if her own embrace could somehow ward off the cold and the presence of the boy across the room. Ryder had slumped against a stack of crates, his head bowed, the picture of defeated arrogance. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing within the four wooden walls. It was Ryder who broke the silence, his voice a low, gritty sound in the gloom. "This is your fault, you know." Jade's head snapped up, her eyes, now adjusted to the dark, flashing with a fresh wave of anger. "My fault? You were the one who insisted on the more efficient path. Your stupid, reckless pride led us right into this." "My pride?" He pushed himself up, his silhouette tense against the gray light. "You're the one who had to prove a point. You could have just stayed with the group, but no, Jade always has to be right, always has to show she's better." "Better than you? At common sense? That's not a high bar to clear." Her voice echoed in the small space, sharp and brittle. They went on like that, their words volleying back and forth, accusations flying like arrows in the dark. They rehashed every slight, every past argument, every test score and project grade, using their shared history as a weapon. The confined space amplified their anger, making every hissed insult feel louder, every frustrated gesture feel more violent. The air grew thick with the heat of their fury, a temporary, illusory warmth generated solely by their clashing wills. They were two caged animals, and the only thing they knew how to do was fight. But the human body has its limits, and fury cannot fuel it forever. As the second hour bled into the third, their energy began to wane. The cold was a more persistent enemy than each other. Their arguments became shorter, punctuated by longer stretches of shivering silence. The adrenaline faded, leaving them hollow and exhausted. Jade finally slid down the wall, her legs giving way, until she was sitting on the cold floor, her chin resting on her knees. Ryder, watching her, let out a long, weary breath and did the same, the distance between them still a vast, unbridgeable chasm. The gray light from the high window began to fade, signaling the approach of night. The darkness in the cabin became absolute, a suffocating blackness that felt heavy and alive. The sounds of the storm seemed louder in the dark, every creak of the old wooden structure making them jump. The bravado and anger had burned away, leaving behind a more primal, unsettling emotion, fear. They were just two teenagers, alone, cold, and truly scared. It was in this pitch blackness that a new sound emerged, one that was small and vulnerable and cut through the tension more effectively than any shout. It was a soft, choked sob. Jade, with her face buried in her knees, was crying. She tried to stifle it, to hide this ultimate sign of weakness from him, but the tears were a release she could no longer control. They were tears of cold, of fear, of utter helplessness. The sound seemed to physically strike Ryder. All the fight drained out of him. The image of the proud, unshakable Jade, reduced to quiet tears in the dark, was somehow more terrifying than the storm. He didn't speak. For a long time, he just listened, the sound of her crying a more profound accusation than any she had hurled at him. Then, moving slowly, as if approaching a startled deer, he shifted. He didn't move towards her, but he pushed a small, dusty burlap sack that had been near his crates across the floor with his foot. It came to a stop a few inches from her leg. "Here," he said, his voice hoarse, stripped of all its usual mockery. "It's not much, but it's dry. Stuff it inside your jacket. It'll help." The gesture was so small, so practical, and so utterly unexpected that Jade's crying hitched. In the oppressive blackness, this tiny act of truce felt monumental. She fumbled for the sack, her fingers numb with cold, and pressed the rough, dry material against her chest. It did nothing to stop her shivering, but the intention behind it sent a different kind of warmth through her, one she didn't understand. Silence descended again, but this time it was different. The angry silence had been loud and sharp. This new silence was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts and the slow, terrifying dismantling of the personas they had worn for so long. The wall was still there, but in the absolute darkness, with the storm raging outside, they could both feel the first, hairline fractures beginning to form. They were no longer just rivals trapped together. They were two human beings, sharing the same fundamental need for warmth, for safety, and for a way to survive the long, cold night that stretched out before them. The night wore on, an endless, shivering stretch of time measured only by the gradual, imperceptible lessening of the rain's fury on the roof. The initial, fragile truce born from Jade's tears and Ryder's small act of kindness settled into a state of exhausted, mutual endurance. They remained on opposite sides of the cabin, a deliberate no-man's land of dusty floorboards between them, but the hostility had been leached away by the cold, leaving behind a raw, shared vulnerability. The darkness was so complete it felt like a physical substance, pressing in on them from all sides, and in that void, the other person's breathing, the faint rustle of their clothes, became a tether to reality, a proof that they were not entirely alone in the abyss. It was during the deepest part of the night, when the cold had sunk into their very marrow and their shivering had become a constant, uncontrollable tremor, that the storm delivered its most terrifying blow. A tremendous crack of thunder exploded directly overhead, a sound so immediate and violent it seemed to shake the very foundations of the old cabin. It was followed instantly by a blinding fork of lightning that lit up the world for a split second through the grimy high window, casting stark, monstrous shadows that danced and vanished before their eyes. Jade, who had been drifting in a cold, hazy state between waking and sleeping, jolted violently. A sharp, involuntary gasp escaped her, a sound of pure, unguarded fear. It was a reflex, an animal response to the sudden, overwhelming violence of nature. In the echoing silence that followed the thunderclap, her ragged breathing was the only sound. And then, from across the darkness, came Ryder's voice, quiet and steady. "It's just noise." The simplicity of the statement, its calm certainty, was an anchor in the chaos. Jade didn't answer. She just hugged her knees tighter, trying to still the trembling that was now as much from fright as from the cold. A few minutes later, another, slightly more distant roll of thunder grumbled through the mountains. She flinched again, a smaller, more subdued reaction, but a reaction nonetheless. She heard movement then. The soft scuff of shoes on wood. He wasn't coming directly towards her, he was moving slowly, deliberately, giving her every opportunity to tell him to stop, to retreat back into their fortified corners. He stopped just at the edge of her personal space, and then she felt, rather than saw, him lower himself to the floor, sitting with his back against the same wall she was leaning on, a careful, respectable foot of space between them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was a third presence in the room, but it was no longer the loud, angry silence of before. This was a waiting, breathing silence. The simple fact of his proximity, the faint warmth of another human being so close, began to work on her. The rigid tension in her shoulders, held for so many hours, began to slowly, reluctantly, ease. "It's stupid," she whispered finally, the words seeming to tear themselves from her throat. She wasn't looking at him, she was staring into the blackness. "I know it's just noise. But it feels like the sky is breaking apart." "It's not stupid," he replied, his voice low. "It's loud. And we're in a wooden box in the middle of it. It would be stupid not to be scared." This, from him, was a revelation. An admission of fallibility. The great Ryder, admitting that fear was a rational response. It was the second crack in the wall, wider than the first. Another silence fell, but this one felt different, lighter, as if the shared admission had thinned the air between them. The next time the thunder came, a low, rolling boom in the distance, Jade still jumped, but her arm, jerking nervously, brushed against his. A spark, not of anger, but of simple, human contact, jolted up her skin. She expected him to pull away, to make a sarcastic comment. He didn't move. And then, something shifted. It was a decision made not with words, but with a slow, silent, mutual understanding born from sheer, desperate need. The cold was winning. Their individual body heat was not enough. The foot of space between them was a luxury they could no longer afford. Slowly, hesitantly, Ryder shifted his weight. He didn't ask. He simply moved, closing that final, symbolic distance until his side was pressed against hers, from shoulder to hip. The contact was electric, overwhelming. He was solid and real in the formless dark. For a single, suspended moment, Jade froze, every instinct telling her to recoil, to rebuild the wall, to defend her space. But the cold was a more powerful instinct. She let out a shuddering sigh, a final surrender, and leaned into him. The warmth was immediate, a profound, radiating heat that began to seep through their damp jackets, through their chilled skin. It was a warmth that had nothing to do with argument or victory. It was fundamental. It was life. He was stiff at first, too, this new intimacy as alien to him as it was to her. Then, tentatively, he lifted his arm and draped it over her shoulders, pulling her more firmly against his side. She stiffened for a heartbeat before melting into the embrace, her head coming to rest against his shoulder. The position was awkward and yet perfectly, utterly right. They sat like that, two former enemies fused together for survival, as the storm finally began to quiet, its rage spent, leaving behind only the steady, gentle patter of a calming rain. In the warm, shared silence, the last of their defenses crumbled into dust. The wall was gone, and in its place was only the profound, terrifying, and undeniable truth of another human being's heartbeat. The dawn did not arrive with a brilliant sunrise, but with a slow, grey leaching of the darkness. The high window, once a square of pure black, became a smudge of pale, watery light, revealing the cabin in all its dusty, neglected detail. The crates were revealed to be filled with rotten burlap and rusted tools. The floor was a mosaic of grime and the dried puddles they had created. The storm was over, replaced by a steady, dripping silence from the sodden trees outside. In the dim light, the reality of their situation was both more mundane and more profound. They were still trapped, but the night had passed. They were still entangled. Somewhere in the deep, exhausted hours before dawn, their position had shifted. They had slid down the wall, still locked together, until they were lying on the rough, unforgiving floorboards. Jade's head was pillowed on Ryder's chest, her arm draped across his waist. One of his arms was curled around her shoulders, his hand resting lightly on her back. His other hand was buried in her hair, which had dried into a wild, tangled mess. They were a single unit, a tangle of limbs and shared warmth, breathing in a slow, synchronized rhythm. The desperate clutch for survival had, in sleep, softened into something that looked, and felt, remarkably like an embrace. Jade was the first to stir. Consciousness returned not all at once, but in slow, warm waves. The first thing she registered was not the hard floor or the chill in the air, but a profound, encompassing warmth. It was a solid, steady heat that radiated through the fabric of his jacket and seeped into her very bones. Then came the sound, a low, rhythmic thrumming beneath her ear. It was his heartbeat, a steady, calming drum against the side of her face. It was the most real, the most alive sound she had ever heard. For a long, disorienting moment, she simply existed within the sensation, safe and warm, her mind blissfully empty of thought. Then, awareness crashed down upon her. Her eyes flew open. She saw the faded plaid of his shirt, felt the steady rise and fall of his chest under her cheek. She was wrapped around Ryder. Ryder. Her rival. The boy she had spent years building walls against. And in her sleep, she had not just tolerated his presence, she had burrowed into it. A hot flush of pure, unadulterated panic swept through her. She froze, every muscle locking, her breath catching in her throat. What had they done? What did this mean? She had to move. She had to put space between them, to re-establish the boundaries that had been utterly obliterated by the storm and the cold and the dark. She began to pull away, a slow, careful retreat, trying to extricate her arm from around his waist. The movement woke him. He stirred with a soft, sleepy sound, his body tensing for a second as he, too, returned to reality. His hand, which had been resting on her back, flexed slightly, a reflexive gesture that felt strangely like holding on. His eyes opened, heavy-lidded and confused, and looked down. His gaze met hers. The world stopped. There was no smirk. No arrogance. No challenge. His eyes, in the grey morning light, were just eyes, sleep-softened, unguarded, and holding a mirror of her own stunned confusion. He was looking at her as if he were seeing her for the very first time, not as an opponent to be bested, but as a person. A girl he had held in his arms all night. The intensity of that look pinned her in place, her retreat halted halfway. She could see the same questions swirling in his gaze that were screaming in her own mind. What is this? What happens now? Neither of them spoke. Words were too clumsy, too inadequate for the chasm that had just opened up between their old world and this new, terrifying one. The air in the cabin was thick with unspoken admissions, with the ghost of shared warmth and vulnerability. His heartbeat, which had been a comfort moments before, now felt like a frantic drumbeat counting down the seconds of this impossible truce. It was Ryder who broke the spell, but not with words. He moved his hand from her back, his fingers brushing lightly against her arm as he withdrew, the touch sending a final, confusing shiver through her. He slowly sat up, running a hand through his own disheveled hair, his gaze shifting away from her to survey the cabin, as if reorienting himself to a world that had fundamentally changed. Jade scrambled to her feet, her body feeling stiff and alien. She busied herself with straightening her hopelessly wrinkled and dirty clothes, avoiding looking at him directly. The silence was back, but it was a new kind of silence, fraught and heavy, buzzing with everything that had been felt but not said. They were no longer enemies sharing a prison. They were two people who had shared a secret, intimate space, and now they had to figure out how to step back out into the light and pretend it had never happened. The rescue, when it came with the distant sound of voices calling their names, felt less like a salvation and more like an interruption. They walked out of the cabin side by side, but the glance they shared before stepping into the open was a silent pact, a shared understanding that the world outside could never know about the night the walls had crumbled to dust.